The standard historical narrative of the 1942 summer campaign on the Eastern Front is typically dominated by a single catastrophic word: Stalingrad. This grand strategic saga, as detailed by David M. Glantz in To the Gates of Stalingrad, University Press of Kansas, 2009, is framed as a massive linear race for industrial icons and oil fields, ending in the frozen ruins of the Volga River basin, where the German Sixth Army was systematically surrounded and destroyed. Yet, this traditional focus on the urban meat grinder of Stalingrad obscures a far more critical operational bottleneck that occurred hundreds of miles to the north, along the open steppes of the Don River Bend, during the opening weeks of Case Blue in June and July 1942. The true turning point of the campaign did not occur in the wreckage of the tractor factory or on the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan, but at the spatial hinge of the entire Soviet southern sector, the ancient city of Voronezh. When Field Marshal Fedor von Bock launched Army Group South into the dry, sun-baked landscape of the Russian steppe on June 28, 1942, the primary military objective was not the immediate occupation of territory, but the systematic encirclement and destruction of the Soviet operational reserves before they could withdraw across the natural barrier of the Don River. General Hermann Hothâ's Fourth Panzer Army was tasked with a rapid, deep penetration drive toward Voronezh to establish a secure, impenetrable blocking line along the Don, shielding the northern flank of the Sixth Army as it marched toward Stalingrad. Geographically, Voronezh was of paramount operational importance because it sat directly at the junction of the Soviet central and southern defensive sectors, representing the critical gate through which Soviet High Command could transfer strategic reserves from the Moscow sector to reinforce the south. Historically, Hoth's armoured spearheads reached the western bank of the Don River and the outer suburbs of Voronezh by July 5, 1942. However, rather than establishing a rapid defensive shield and continuing the encirclement of Soviet forces on the western bank of the Don, Hoth's forces became heavily embroiled in vicious, localized street fighting inside the urban core of Voronezh. This delay, compounded by Adolf Hitler's erratic and micromanaging radio directives, allowed the bulk of the Soviet southwestern and southern fronts to slip through the gap, executing an orderly fighting retreat to the east. This crucial escape preserved the very forces that would later form the iron fist of Georgy Zhukov's strategic counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, which ultimately sealed the fate of the Sixth Army. In his masterful work, Death of the Wehrmacht, The German Campaigns of 1942, University Press of Kansas, 2007, military historian Robert M. Citino analyzes the deep command friction that paralyzed the German offensive at Voronezh. According to Citino, the German military doctrine of Bewegungskrieg, or mobile maneuver warfare, relied entirely on the rapid encirclement of enemy forces in the open field, avoiding prolonged battles of attrition inside urban areas. However, at Voronezh, the German High Command fell victim to a profound tactical illusion, choosing to commit the elite division-level assets of the Fourth Panzer Army to house-by-house fighting inside the city blocks rather than executing a deep flanking sweep to trap the retreating Red Army divisions. While German infantry and armoured elements of the Großdeutschland division were locked in combat over individual factories and railway buildings in the western suburbs of Voronezh, Stalin and the Soviet Stavka were gripped by a state of absolute strategic panic. Stalin was utterly convinced that the entire German summer offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields was a massive operational feint, and that the real strategic blow of 1942 would still fall on Moscow. This miscalculation, documented by John Erickson in The Road to Stalingrad, Yale University Press, 1999, led Stalin to concentrate massive, newly raised armoured reserves, including the newly formed 5th Tank Army, directly north of Voronezh to block any potential German turn toward the Soviet capital. This concentration of Soviet armor created a highly volatile operational environment. While Stalin's panic kept these massive reserves pinned in place to protect the northern road to Moscow, General Philip Golikov's Bryansk front realized the immediate danger of encirclement in the south. Seizing the window of opportunity provided by Hoth's delay in the streets of Voronezh, Golikov authorized a swift fighting retreat for his exposed southern divisions. Instead of standing and dying on the western bank of the Don River, the Soviet armies melted away under the cover of night, withdrawing their heavy artillery, tank units, and vital manpower across the river to the east, escaping the German jaws just as they were beginning to close. To reconstruct the counterfactual pivot of July 1942, we must look at the moment when Field Marshal Fedor von Bock and General Hermann Hothâ confront the erratic radio orders emanating from the Wolf's Lair. Historically, Hitler's impatience with the pace of the Voronezh fighting led him to split Army Group South into Army Group A and Army Group B, ordering Hothâ to immediately disengage from the city and march south to assist the Sixth Army's drive toward the Volga. This micromanagement split the German command, leaving the Sixth Army logistically overextended and the Fourth Panzer Army caught in a state of operational limbo, turning south too late to catch the retreating Soviets and too early to secure the northern flank at Voronezh. In our alternative scenario, Field Marshal von Bock enforces strict operational discipline, prioritizing the traditional German doctrine of Vernichtungsgedanke, the battle of annihilation. Bock recognizes that the destruction of the Soviet operational reserves on the western bank of the Don is the indispensable prerequisite for any successful drive toward the Volga or the Caucasus. Ignoring Hitler's frantic, micromanaging radio directives to disengage and turn south, Bock orders Hothâ to disengage his panzers from the urban core of Voronezh and execute a classic, deep, double-enveloping maneuver to the north and south of the city. The Fourth Panzer Army's Texkark-Awakin Panzer Corps swings wide around the northern suburbs of Voronezh, forcing a rapid, uncontested crossing of the Voronezh River near the town of Ramon, while the Sixth Army's Platoon Panzer Corps strikes hard from the south, crossing the Don River near Gremiachi. This dual-armoured thrust completely bypasses the urban street fighting, isolating the city and slamming the door shut on the retreating Soviet forces. The two German panzer pincers link up 30 miles east of the Don River, near the critical railway junction of Anna, trapping the entire Soviet 40th Army, the 60th Army, and the massive vanguard of the 5th Tank Army in a colossal, inescapable cauldron. The liquidation of the Voronezh Cauldron in July 1942 represents an operational disaster of unprecedented proportions for the Red Army. Trapped in a massive pocket, with their backs to the natural barrier of the Don River and cut off from their supply lines, over 400,000 Soviet troops are systematically compressed and ground down by the combined fire of German infantry divisions and concentrated air support from General Wolfram von Richthofen's 8th Air Corps. Unlike the historical Battle of Voronezh, where Soviet tank units launched disjointed, uncoordinated counterattacks that were easily picked off by German anti-tank defenses, the encirclement of the 5th Tank Army inside the cauldron prevents any organized operational maneuver. The tactical cost to the Soviet Union is catastrophic. In less than 2 weeks of intense combat, the Red Army loses over 3,000 tanks, 5,000 artillery pieces, and the core of its most experienced mobile formations. The strategic reserve that Stalin had painstakingly spent 9 months building after the victory at Moscow is utterly vaporized. The destruction of these veteran divisions leaves a massive 300-mile gap in the Soviet southern front, stretching from Voronezh all the way to the outskirts of Stalingrad, with virtually no organized Soviet forces left to defend the open steppe. This decisive German victory completely alters the logistical calculus of the 1942 campaign. In the historical timeline, the Wehrmacht was forced to stretch its supply lines to the breaking point to maintain two simultaneous offensive directions, Caucasus and Stalingrad, while constantly fighting off fierce Soviet flank attacks from the north. In this scenario, with the Soviet southern reserves completely annihilated, the northern flank along the Don River is quiet and secure. The Wehrmacht is able to consolidate its logistical hubs around Kharkov and Voronezh, establishing a single, highly efficient supply line that can easily support the subsequent advances towards the east and south without fear of Soviet counterstrokes. With the Soviet Bryansk and southwestern fronts utterly destroyed in the Voronezh Cauldron, the strategic dominoes across the southern USSR begin to fall with terrifying speed. Historically, the defense of Stalingrad in late August 1942 was a desperate touch-and-go affair, conducted by the shattered remnants of retreating Soviet divisions and freshly raised, poorly trained local militias. In our alternative timeline, those veteran retreating divisions do not exist. They have been buried in the soil of the Voronezh pocket. Consequently, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army marches across the Don steppe completely unopposed, entering the city of Stalingrad in late July 1942. The Volga River line is secured without a single shot fired in anger inside the city blocks of Stalingrad, completely sparing the Sixth Army from the exhausting, demoralizing urban battle of attrition that historically broke its back. With Hoth's Fourth Panzer Army holding an impenetrable, deeply echeloned defensive barrier along the Volga River from Saratov to Astrakhan, the entire northern flank of the German offensive is secure. This allows Field Marshal Wilhelm List's Army Group A to sweep into the Caucasus oil fields with its supply lines perfectly intact and its flanks protected by the natural barrier of the Volga. The strategic consequences for the Soviet war effort are fatal. By September 1942, the key oil refineries of Maikop, Grozny and Baku have fallen to the advancing German spearheads, cutting off over 80% of the Soviet Union's domestic fuel supply. At the same time, because the strategic reserves of the Bryansk and southwestern fronts were liquidated at Voronezh, the Soviet Stavka is structurally incapable of assembling the million-man force required to execute Operation Uranus. There is no iron pincer to trap Paulus's Sixth Army, and no reserves to launch a counteroffensive. The Red Army is forced to withdraw past the Volga River, abandoning the agricultural and industrial heartlands of European Russia, leaving Stalin's regime isolated, starved of fuel, and strategically crippled. In the final analysis, the Eastern Front was not a war of map pins, ideological slogans, or urban symbols. It was a brutal, relentless math equation of attrition, spatial geometry, and operational reserves. The historical German failure in Case Blue was not decided by the tactical brilliance of Soviet soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad, but by the structural failure of the German High Command to capture and destroy the Soviet operational reserves on the western bank of the Don River during the opening weeks of the offensive. By allowing Hoth's Fourth Panzer Army to become entangled in the urban street fighting of Voronezh, the Wehrmacht guaranteed its own slow logistical death in the ruins of Stalingrad. The Voronezh Cauldron represents the ultimate what-if of the 1942 campaign, the fleeting moment where a single disciplined operational decision could have severed the logistical spine of the Soviet Union. Had the German Panzer Corps adhered to their doctrine of mobile maneuver and bypassed the city to trap the retreating Red Army, the entire strategic balance of the war would have swung in Germany's favor. Instead, the Voronezh illusion enticed the German command into a localized, tactically insignificant victory, allowing the real prize to slip through their fingers and setting the stage for the catastrophic collapse of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front.